This is still part of 100 Wonders, the October edition. North of Rome, in the woods of Italy, there are monsters lurking. We tend to think of urban exploration as a relatively modern affair, but it has parallels that go back much farther than that. Interested, curious writers and artists tend to seek out the odd and unusual. In the case of Salvador Dali, he found something truly spectacular. In 1938, he came across what the locals called the Parco dei Monstri, or the Park of Monsters. The Garden of Monsters was commissioned in 1552 by Prince Pier Francesco Orsini. And he didn't commission this to be beautiful or to impress you. He wanted it to shock you. The prince was returning from a brutal war. He had seen his best friend die, and then he'd been captured himself and held ransom for over 3 years. When he was finally released and got home to his beloved wife, she died shortly thereafter. One thought is that he commissioned the Park of Monsters as a way to deal with the immense grief that came along with all of this tragedy. An inscription at the entrance to the park says, "Those who do not visit this place with raised eyebrows and pursed lips will fail to admire the 7 wonders of the world." He was like, this place is nuts, and if you're not into it, then nothing's gonna float your boat. In this park is a giant elephant lifting a Roman soldier. There is a house purposely made to slant in a strange and disorienting lean. 2 giants ripping each other apart. A sculpture of a giant fish with a little world and a castle on top. And the idea is that the fish is time itself and it dwarfs everything else. These are creatures from beyond space and time, long before Lovecraft. It's all ancient monsters. It's a bestiary. And of course, most captivating of all is the enormous head of Orcus, god of the underworld. His maw wide and gaping, begging for you to step inside. On Orcus's upper lip is the inscription, "All thoughts fly," which is a theme throughout the gardens. This notion that basically you will be rendered senseless by the aesthetic experience. Also, as a kind of a trick, it's like a whispering gallery, so if you stand in a certain place, people at the bottom of the steps can hear you speak. So you could go in there and be like, "This is Orcus, go away." Once the prince died in the 1580s, no more work was done on the park, and by the 1800s and 1900s, it had fallen entirely into disrepair and become basically a spooky legend for the locals. So the entire park has this kind of incredible surrealist feel to it, which is why when Dali discovered it or rediscovered it, he was like, "This is my jam." He made a short film about it. It inspired a painting of his. He sort of brought it back into public consciousness, and it was finally restored in the 1950s and has gone on to become a well-visited attraction. We don't have any records of what the prince's mind state was when he built the Park of Monsters, and whether he was working through his grief or simply just wanted to do something that was different from the fancy schmancy sculptures going on around him. He really created a unique destination, and although it may be shrouded in mystery, Salvador Dali certainly knew it was special when he stumbled upon it. More videos here. the small Romanian town of Săpență, when you die, you can expect a colorful farewell. Death is considered a somber and even scary thing here in the United States. Funerals are sad affairs, and cemeteries aren't meant for the living to tread. We've never believed that here at Atlas Obscura. We celebrate in cemeteries and consider ourselves pretty death positive. If you don't know what that could possibly mean, you should just ask a mortician. But in the small town of Săpență, Romania, they share our views about death. Because if you want to see the humor or joy in dying, just take a walk in the Mary Cemetery. When someone dies, their memory often enters a kind of idealized state. We tell the good stories about them and not the bad stories. If their death was tragic, we gloss over it. We end up with this kind of tiny version of this person's life, often reduced to as little as rest in peace on their tombstone. Not so at the Mary Cemetery. Stan Iwa Patras was born in the small Romanian town of Săpență in 1908. By the young age of 14, he was already carving the crosses for the local cemetery. By 1935, he was adding little limericks, painting images of the deceased onto the wooden marker, even sometimes painting the way they died onto the markers. A soldier with his head being cut off, or someone being hit by a truck. He created this kind of folk art around the deceased. On the grave markers, yellow represented fertility, green represented life, red represented passion, black represented death. Sometimes there was a dove that represented the soul, or a blackbird that would represent a particular tragic or suspicious death. And it was always set against a deep blue called Săpență blue, which he believed represented not just his hometown, but hope, possibility, freedom. But another thing that worked its way onto the grave markers wasn't just this symbolism, but his dark sense of humor. One reads, "Here lies my mother-in-law, try not to wake her up, for if she comes back, she'll bite my head off." Another one says, "He loved horses, but not as much as he loved sitting next to someone else's wife at the bar." Patras single-handedly carved over 800 of these grave markers. It was his singular vision to make the cemetery a place that was bright and colorful and funny and rude and full of life in a way that very few cemeteries ever are. Stan Patras died in 1977, but not before he carved his own cross, painted it, and handed the work to his most talented apprentice, Dumitru Pop. Pop has carried on the tradition for the last 4 decades, and the cemetery has developed a small museum to go with it. Despite the dark comedy or sometimes just dark themes of the crosses, no one has ever complained. They want to see their real lives represented. If the person liked to drink, you show that. If they like to work, you show that. It's a small town, there are no secrets. People want the reality. As we all know, life is messy. Why not show that in death as you lived it in life?
Ocean and sea forts are few and far between, and with good reason. Only in fairly extreme circumstances is their expense deemed justifiable. Since being decommissioned, many of these have gained strange second lives as everything from luxury resorts and private retreats to micronations and pirate radio stations. It sounds extreme, but be honest, wouldn't you want a sea fort of your very own?
In the middle of the Turkmenistan desert is a 230-foot wide hole. And the hole, it's on fire. In 1971, a group of Soviet petroleum geologists set out across the desert of Turkmenistan, and they were on the hunt for petroleum. And when they found a place that they thought would be full of oil, they decided to set up a drilling rig. Unfortunately for them, they set this drilling rig up over what turned out to be an enormous cavern of natural gas. And when they punched in through the top of the desert, the entire thing collapsed, taking the drilling rig with it. And even more problematic than that is now leaking from this gigantic hole was methane gas, which is a potentially deadly and definitely super explosive gas. So the Soviet geologists did what was for them the sensible thing. They lit the hole on fire. The scientists thought when they lit this crater on fire that it would burn for a few weeks, maybe a few months, and then it would just extinguish itself. It has been burning for over 40 years. Locals call this the gates of hell, or the door to hell, or more scientifically, the Darvaza gas crater. In 2009, the Turkmen president declared that he wanted the gates of hell closed, capped, that it was an embarrassment to the country. But that hasn't happened, and in fact, the gates of hell have become a kind of tourist site. Even the Minister of Tourism now cites it as one of their major attractions. And for a country that only sees between 10 and 15,000 tourists a year, it's a big deal that people are excited to go to the gates of hell. It's also said that the crater attracts local spiders drawn to the light and the heat, which come to the edge of the crater and then throw themselves into it. Presumably, they are trying to reunite themselves with their Dark Lord. So the crater has been burning for 40 years, and there's no telling when it will stop. But with continued tourist interest, it's likely that it may be burning for some time.